You are listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast with Buck Joffrey. Get ready to change your life.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula Podcast coming to you from Montecito, California. Before we start, remember there is a website associated with this particular podcast at wealthformula.com. Lots of resources and lists for you to sign up there and get involved with our community. Today's show is going to be a little bit different. We're not going to really talk about money, but we are going to talk about probably the most significant element of wealth, which is really being healthy and having a long health span, that is. Because after all, what is all this wealth stuff for anyway? I've spent, the last 15 years, after residency training, trying to accumulate wealth. And it wasn't until about 2 years ago that I actually decided to start spending it. Why? Well, there were some major changes in my life, and it made me think about mortality. Now, of course, those were not, they weren't health scares or anything. They're just things in your life that happen. In my case, divorce and that kind of thing, that all of a sudden, kicks you in the butt and says, whoa, what's going on? Where are you? How old are you? And where are you in life? Right? So anyway, but bottom line is, everyone has to die someday, right? So anyway, I started thinking about that kind of stuff. And before this realization, I was doing what pretty much all responsible professionals do. I was working hard and I wouldn't spend much money on myself. In fact, up until, before the pandemic, I was still driving like my 2009 Prius, it's a 2007 Prius. And that Prius, was basically my daily driver, and I just didn't really care. And I was like, well, whatever, I'll buy something nice someday, right? And so that's kind of like the way I was about myself. I just didn't really spend anything on myself. It was all about creating wealth and not really spending any of it. And in hindsight, I don't really understand what I was waiting for. I mean, I probably, in fact, should have been spending more money on myself in my 20s and 30s and had some more fun, because I, like many surgical residents and doctors and stuff like that, sacrificed a significant portion of our youth, in our 20s and 30s, early 30s even, to this training, and, didn't really get to sort of have some of the fun that I think others do in their 20s. Of course, I can't change that now, and I'm aware of that, but what I can do is to start enjoying life as soon as possible, which is now, and try to figure out how to stay feeling young and living as long as possible feeling young, so that I can spend a lot of time making up for lost time. The good news for us is that there is actually a tremendous amount of science and technology growth in the field of longevity, and it's developing fast. And we're talking about not only living longer, but living like healthier longer, right? So, like being 100 years old would be like being 70. 100 is the new 70. That's kind of the idea. We know so much more than our parents did on what to eat, how often to eat, how to optimize exercise, and what supplements and prescription drugs appear to lengthen not only lifespan, but again, more importantly, health span. There's so much information out there that is also, I have to tell you, to be very careful. Just think about all the money that, selling people a fountain of youth can make. So it's ripe for fraud, right? There's a lot of people who are going to try to rip you off. So you got to be careful of that. Now, that being said, as a physician, and of course I'm not practicing, but I still have a medical degree and surgical training and all that mumbo jumbo. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what's real and what's not in this space. I find it extremely fascinating. Some of my friends and investors in our own community have pivoted their careers to the practice of longevity medicine, which I think is phenomenal. I think they are going exactly where the puck is going. And those are the people who know a lot more than me in this field, even though, I try to keep on it myself as well. And one of these guys is Dr. Rob Hamilton. Now, Rob spoke at our last Wealth Formula event, and I got to tell you, he seriously blew the audience away with his presentation. He is an encyclopedia of knowledge in the field of longevity, and my and my guest on Wealth Formula podcast this week. So Rob is, we're having one of our own interviewed this week. Now, if this stuff is new for you, I strongly urge you to start paying attention, looking what's out there, and try to follow along. After all, what's the point of accumulating this wealth if you don't have a long, healthy life to enjoy it, right? So whether you are already on that journey or are interested in learning more, you will want to listen to this podcast. I'm biased because of my interest, but I think you might find this to be one of the most useful podcasts, from Wealth Formula at least, that you've ever listened to in your life. With that being said, we will come back with Rob Hamilton right after these messages. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Wealth Formula Podcast, he's one of us. He is Dr. Rob Hamilton, a guy who is part of our Wealth Formula community. He is a physician with a medical degree from the University of Colorado. He's board certified in emergency medicine. But more importantly, in my view, he's one of the smartest guys I know when it comes to this whole longevity medicine movement. And for those of you who came to our last event, you were probably completely blown away by his talk as he gave this, tremendous overview of longevity and the literature. And basically it was stuff that I kind of find more interesting than even money right now. So Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Buck. Very happy to be here.
Yeah. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about what got you interested in, because you were practicing emergency medicine, you were doing this kind of thing. How'd you get into, this wellness and longevity space, and what continues to interest you about that?
Well, mortality.
Yeah, yeah, right.
I mean, one of the things that happens in emergency medicine is, we see the worst of the worst, right?
Yeah.
And one corollary to that is most of the worst of the things you see are more or less preventable or at least delayable, right? You see a lot of heart attacks and strokes and things like that. And you realize after a period of time that chronic disease is killing all of us one way or the other. And the chronic diseases of kind of modern civilization, things like hypertension and, dyslipidemia or high lipids, strokes, heart disease as the end result. Not all of what we do in the ER is gunshots and trauma. A lot of it is just dealing with the ravages of daily life. Yeah. So I turned 40. That's when the night shifts get longer and harder and your mortality starts to creep up on you. I started noticing some abnormalities in my own personal lab work that hadn't been there before. And I said, wow, what's going on? Why is my CRP so high? And that sort of sent me down some rabbit holes into, looking online and reading and learning things that I never learned in medical school, things about diet and exercise and nutrition and sunlight and circadian biology. And then sadly, my, a number of things converged. My father got cancer and I started to realize, gosh, we're all mortal here. And I looked at the struggles he went through. And then some of my colleagues were starting to get into this anti-aging and regenerative medicine field. Yeah. So I went and sought some formal education.
Yeah. And that's great. So, let me just jump right into it. Cause one of the, and your talk was very popular and I'm not just trying to pull your chain here. I was really impressed, like with, your presentation, your sort of body of knowledge in this space. The problem with the space right now is it's all over the place, right? Like there's no protocol. There's no, there's not a lot of, you don't have like randomized control studies. You're never going to do that if you're trying to get into the longevity space because you'll die by the time it's over. But you kind of created a little bit of an infrastructure to explain this. Do you want to kind of dive into that a little bit?
Sure. So, like you say, there is so much information out there. It's overwhelming. It's literally, you can spend hours, and in fact I have and probably continue to do so, reading and tracking down stuff. But as I started to get out of my emergency medicine practice and get more into a wellness and preventative practice, I realized that what people need is, number one, education, and number two, direction. And I tried to distill that information. There's some various trainings I went to. I came up with what I call the 4 pillars, or maybe the 5 pillars actually, of anti-aging medicine. And so one of the things I did when I put together that talk at the Wealth Formula Network conference was just try to distill it down into these are the 5 things to look at, that as of now we have either good, solid clinical evidence, or at least directional evidence telling us this is the right approach. And of course, I'm always looking at this stuff, constantly reading the latest stuff that I can find, trying to understand how to do it better. But, I feel like I'm directionally accurate on these 5 pillars.
Yeah.
So the 5 pillars, because I know that'll be your next question.
Yeah. What are those 5 pillars?
Are number 1, chronobiology.
Would you call it chrono?
Yeah. Chronobiology. So, if you want to dive into that a little bit, what it boils down to is circadian rhythms.
Okay.
Humans are driven by the clock, right? And not the clocks necessarily, but by the natural rhythms of our planet, by the sun and the moon and the tidal cycles and things like that. But for most people, it's really daylight and darkness.
And sleep would be in there too, presumably.
It is huge. And, there's guys like Matthew Walker out there that are, getting real popular in the sleep space, talking about what you can do to improve your sleep. And I've read a bunch of his stuff, looked through his stuff. But the bottom line is we all are biologically meant to be awake during a certain part of the day and asleep during a certain part of the day. And if you look at the literature in medicine, you realize that, for example, night shift workers have a much higher rate of the diseases that kill all of us eventually, right? Cardiovascular disease and such, cancer.
Sure.
And why is that? It's because we're messing with our circadian rhythms. So, the corollary to that is, if you want to be healthy, you got to pay attention to your circadian rhythms.
Right.
The circadian rhythms we were all designed to have.
Are those associated? I mean, it's getting a little technical, but with cortisone levels,
Absolutely, yeah. Cortisol. In fact, if you measure cortisol is one of the hormones that's got what we call a diurnal rhythm. It's got a rhythm of the day. In fact, one of the things that we think helps wake you up in the morning is your cortisol starts to rise. So, in a quote normal person who's sleeping normally and has a quote normal schedule, whatever that means in this modern world, right around 5 a.m., cortisol starts to rise, raises your blood pressure. There's a bunch of molecular conformation changes that happen in the brain as your cortisol rises. And in fact, one of the things I used to see in the ER is, one of the most common times of day for a heart attack is that first few minutes. It's early in the morning.
Yeah.
Highest right cortisol. At the end of our shift,
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about cortisol leads to not only, this increase in MIs and all that in the morning that you talked about, but also from a chronic perspective, insulin resistance, more likelihood of, becoming a diabetic and all those kinds of things. And it's all ultimately kind of related to something that in modern society we've not really taken very seriously, which is sleep.
Right.
And I think that's like a very good place to just focus on for this part. And one question I have for you is, having read that literature, having read, Matt Walker's books, what are just a couple of things that maybe you feel like people don't know that would be useful to know about sleep?
So probably, you could I go on for a long time about the importance of sleep and different phases of sleep, but so many people complain of difficulty sleeping. And I think as I mentioned, from the circadian biology standpoint, one of the most important things you can do to protect your sleep is protect your eyes and by extension, your brain from blue light after sundown, or at least as you get ready to go to bed. And the reason for that is because light in the blue end of the spectrum produces or suppresses the production of a really important sleep hormone called melatonin. And melatonin is produced in the pineal gland and helps put you to sleep. So one of the simple, cheap tricks that you can use is to wear, for example, blue light blocking glasses as the sun goes down. And I tell a lot of people that a lot of patients notice that, boy, they start to get more and more sleepy at night. Now it's hard to stay up till 3 a.m. and watch Netflix if you're falling asleep with your white glasses. But guess what? You shouldn't be doing that anyway for your health.
Hey, Rob, blue light, is that just screens, or is that even just like, ambient light from your light bulbs and that kind of thing?
So sadly, buckets everywhere. I mean, screens is huge. In fact, you notice Apple has come up with night shift for their phones. There's a number of applications for your computer. One is called Flux that will temper the blue light. But most of us have gone to indoor lighting now that's produced by LEDs because they're cheap, they're energy efficient, they last forever, as opposed to the old incandescent light bulbs. But the spectrum of LED lighting, the so-called white light coming from LEDs, usually has a huge spike in the blue range. And so, unfortunately, I think as we transition more to LEDs for our indoor lighting, we're going to find more and more trouble sleeping.
Yeah, the incandescent,
it's everywhere.
The incandescent light bulbs, are those safe, so to speak, or they're going to have some level of blue light as well?
They're safer. They're not entirely safe. And I have a tremendous graphic I could probably pull up and send to you or email to you that shows the different light spectrum from different bulbs.
Yeah.
But incandescents are very energy efficient, right? They get hot. A lot of the light comes off in the red and the yellow end of the spectrum and less in the blue.
Right.
LED and then halogens are, different. They have a different spectrum, but LEDs typically come out with a lot of energy in the blue. They don't get hot. That's another great thing about them. You'll never start your house on fire with an LED bulb. But the sad thing is you've got a lot of blue light exposure there.
Let's move on to the next pillar.
Yeah, you bet. Next pillar, diet, nutrition, and supplements. So I put all these together because, everybody knows that what you eat is, really important for your health. And if you look at historically what the rates of chronic disease and obesity and things like that in the U.S. are, you'll find that prior to 1980, they were a lot lower than they are now. And that's despite a deluge of information about, what you should eat: low fat, low cholesterol, low carb, gluten-free. And it's a very confusing space. And I'm always looking for a better way to recommend what people eat to enhance longevity. And the other thing that's important about diet is what you don't eat or when you eat. In fact, almost weekly now, you'll see in major news sources things published on intermittent fasting. Our bodies were not designed to be fed small amounts of high calorie density, low nutrient density foods 24/7. And so going through the drive-through at, your local fast food restaurant at 2 a.m. is terrible for your health, sadly. It's time your body's not meant to eat, and particularly the kind of stuff you get there. So pillar 2 is really focused around what you eat and when you eat.
So it's interesting to me about this topic is that, in medicine, we've been giving people, not you and me, but the medical world has been giving people a very different story for years and years. And they, the food pyramid, and there was obviously some reports about how that food pyramid was really affected by, the sugar industry and that kind of thing.
I've seen those.
But, it's funny because I remember being in, I think it was like 3rd or 4th grade, and my teacher said we were doing this thing on food pyramid, and he's like, can anybody think of the perfect food? And based on this, and he said, well, it's pizza, of course. Pizza's got everything here, and that.
Oh yeah, I think I had the same thought.
Right, but so
mostly plant-based.
So I think the thing to focus on there, right, is, and tell me if you agree with this, but I think the biggest difference in terms of, what we used to say and what we know I think is true right now is that sugar is bad. I mean, sugar is kind of the devil.
Correct. And many of the foods that have been regarded as, quote, healthy, unquote, for many years basically break down to sugar. So it comes down to carbohydrate consumption, and whether it's simple sugars like sugar, like sucrose, table sugar, or really complicated but relatively simple sugars like high fructose corn syrup, which I can't imagine who would argue that's good for you at this point. There's so much data. Or even just these really complicated carbohydrate sugars like bagels, for example. I mean, and they're extremely high in caloric density, but they have almost none of the nutrients that your body really needs. And so overconsumption of those is very bad.
So it's funny, even a few years ago, like I'm talking about maybe 3-4 years ago, I was talking to my physician at the time, who's since retired. And he was a good guy, and I, wasn't really into all this stuff. And I brought up this concept of intermittent fasting or the intermittent feeding, or whatever you want to call it, time restricted feeding. And he said, well, you can do it if you want, but it's really, at the end of the day, it's calories in, calories out. Ends up that's probably not true. Is that right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the data, again, there's so much good stuff, both in the medical literature, if you look, and now in the lay literature about fasting and time-restricted feeding. I mean, when you're fasting, your body is undergoing a process called autophagy. Autophagy is basically recycling. Your body says there's no new energy coming in. I got to figure out what to do with the garbage in the system and recycle as much of that as I can for energy. And so if you never fast, you never undergo autophagy. Your mitochondria, those little batteries in your cells, those little power plants in your cells, you think of fasting as culling the herd of bad mitochondria, right? So when your bad mitochondria when there's not enough energy to feed everything in the body, the body breaks down the bad mitochondria and recycles the components to make new and good mitochondria. The problem is, if you never fast, if you're never without food for a period of time, you will find that those little bad mitochondria just kind of hang around, and the herd gets weaker by the weaker parts of it.
The concept is it's almost Darwinian, right? Like, I mean, if you think about this concept of what we call hormesis comes up a lot, which is, challenging the body to a certain degree. Yeah. But not too much where you get, you get killed by it. So being hungry sometimes is a good thing, because your body needs to be hungry in order to process some of these things. And
for sure,
that's the concept. So intermittent fasting versus time-restricted feeding. I mean, really, is there, and I know I hate to put you on the spot because you're just talking to me, but is there any difference in terms of the effectiveness? Because when you talk about intermittent fasting, it's sometimes like people fasting for like a full day or like 2 days of the week versus restricted time feeding, which is more what I do, which is like I basically eat between 1 and 8 and no calories other than that.
I think so. That's a good question. The challenge with fasting is we know there's great things that it does for the body. We don't know what the right dose is. Think of it as a drug. It's a very, very powerful drug. It does all kinds of amazing things for the body. We don't know the right dose or the right strength to give you. So there are clinics where you can go, Buck, and you can pay them to give you a pitcher of water every day and monitor your vital signs. Yeah. And after 3 weeks, your high blood pressure might be all better, for example, not you specifically, but as a patient. But so there's this spectrum from what you're describing, time restricted feeding, say eating for a 6 to 8 hour window a day, to, maybe fasting for 24 to 36 hours once or twice a week, to, some people recommend a 5 or 7 day fast quarterly. There's a really interesting product developed by a longevity scientist named Walter Longo at UCLA called Prolon. It's what they call a fasting mimicking diet. And he claims to have created the same effects of fasting while eating small amounts of certain macronutrient foods. And I've used that with some patients who've had tremendous success.
Although that diet itself is, you might as well be fasting, right?
Yeah, it's pretty awful, but and some people it works better for than others. But the cool thing is he's got data on this stuff showing people do better with cancer. They tolerate chemotherapy better. After 3 months of doing this for 5 days a month, so 15 days total in 3 months. It's not really aimed at weight loss, although people generally lose a little bit of weight, but their C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker, goes down. Mm-hmm. Their lipid profile tends to normalize. I mean, just 5 days once a month of this this calorie restricted diet, they call the fasting mimicking diet, does really amazing things for people metabolically.
So this is not something you have to keep doing like every day for good. It's like 5 days per month.
That's the fasting mimicking diet.
That's interesting. Okay.
But I think the idea of time restricted feeding daily makes a lot of sense, because if you look at and this is where it's so hard to get data because their studies are all over, but if you look at the alternative, which is you eat constantly all day long, we know that's bad for you. That's what's leading us to so many problems. So if you can restrict your feeding to 4 to 6 hours a day, then your body's essentially fasting, or, for the other, say 20 or 16 to 20 hours, whatever it ends up being. We think that's a good thing. It seems to be
the complicating factor, not complicated, but the confusing thing about this to a lot of people is, again, this is really kind of different from what I grew up believing to be healthy, right? Like if you eat several times a day, small amounts, and that's how you keep, your weight down and all that. But it's the opposite. So it's like, man, I hope this doesn't change again. You know what I mean?
Well, but is that you're right, but also think of how things have changed since you grew up. I don't know. When I grew up, when we generally had 3 meals a day. Yeah. And there wasn't all this snacking built into every day. I mean, now when you take your kids to soccer, the parents draw lots to see who's bringing the snack for the soccer game. And at school they have, quote, nutrition breaks, halfway between breakfast and lunch. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of things have changed since the 70s and the 80s. People eat more frequently. There's a much higher availability of really bad quality food. We also live in a very different environment. Our environment is, you also weren't staying up till 2 a.m. on Instagram. I hope you're not now. But I mean, that stuff all plays in. If you talk about circadian biology and then you talk about eating all this stuff all day long, and then you start to wonder why now like 30% of kids are now obese. In fact, I think just the other day, the American Academy of Pediatrics says that something like 30% of kids are obese, and they're starting to recommend bariatric surgery at age 13 and GLP-1 agonist drugs.
This is crazy.
The world's changed a lot in the last 50 years.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the next pillar.
Sure. Exercise. So, like fasting, exercise, you almost need to consider a drug, to the point where it almost is a necessity. A prescription should be given. And then people say, well, what and how much? And, there's a huge range of what exercise is, from, walking your 10,000 steps a day to running a marathon.
Is there any data that certain kinds, I know we often hear these days about high intensity type workouts and that kind of thing, that might be better than others?
Well, one thing is very clear from the data is, number one, the higher your VO2 max, which is your aerobic capacity, your ability to do kind of aerobic exercise. And that's a test that, they hook you up with a mask on your face and measure your oxygen inspired and your carbon dioxide output. One thing that's clear is the higher your VO2 max, the better your ultimate longevity will be. So we think, based on that some level of cardiovascular exercise, aerobic exercise that helps to maintain and increase your VO2 max is very valuable and required. Now, whether that's high intensity interval training, and that seems to be all the rage right now. And I think the reason for that is it's efficient, right? Everybody's pressed for time. If you can go in the gym and get a good workout in 20 minutes of intervals, that fits most people's schedules. But, you also find that people who are out doing stuff at a lower intensity all day long, like walking or doing physical jobs, can also develop good aerobic fitness. But pushing into high intensity is good periodically, for sure, because you do want to keep that VO2 max up. The other thing that's really clear is resistance exercise or some kind of weight training is absolutely critical as people age. Good muscle mass helps with keeping your metabolism where it needs to be. It also is really important for mobility as people get older. Like it's fine to be 90, but if you can't stand up and you're in a wheelchair and you fall over and you break your hip the first time you try to transfer from the chair to a bed, then what does it matter, right? So you want to be able to get up and walk and go upstairs and things. So resistance training is so critical as people age for longevity.
And that's a good point you bring up too, just to circle back to that a little bit, which is, people, if you go in a room and you ask a bunch of people if they want to live to be 110, actually not as many people would raise your hand as you'd think. And I think it's because people are imagining what you would be like at 110. Yeah. And that's not what we're after. When we're talking about longevity, we're talking about this concept, this potential that through behavior, through exercise, and ultimately pharmaceuticals, that we may be able to say, 100 years old is the new 70 or something like that, and live like a 70-year-old for a period of time, right?
Right. Well, what we really want to do, and this is kind of where I fall with most of our patients, is we can't prove that anything we do increases your lifespan yet. And maybe we never will. Like you say, the controlled studies are not there, and it's going to be really hard to do that. Humans are too complicated. But what we're trying to do is increase what we call your health span, right? I want you to live the most vital life doing the things you want to do, whatever those are, as long as you can, and then die quietly in your sleep, or at least not have a prolonged period of disability because of aging, right? So you're right. Nobody wants to live to 110 probably if they're told, well, you're going to be in a nursing home bed with decubitus ulcers and a feeding tube. But if I could be 110 and, taking a walk every day and going to dinner with some loved ones, then you sign me up.
Yeah,
for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's health span that most everybody's looking for, more so I think than lifespan.
So let's move on to the next pillar.
Sure. Next pillar is where we start to get out of the lifestyle sort of interventions, the chronobiology, diet, exercise, and into something where I think a medical doctor or some kind of a practitioner can be helpful. And it's hormone replacement therapy. So, men and women both are programmed, if you will, to lose our hormones as we age. So women go through a period of time called menopause, which, is they refer to as the change of life. And if you talk to a lot of women about it who've been through menopause, they'll tell you it's like falling off a hormonal cliff. Everything changes almost overnight. Usually it's within a 6 month to a year period of time. And that's when women lose the important, what we call sex steroid hormones, things like testosterone, progesterone, and estradiol. And once that happens, their risk of heart disease goes way up. Their risk of osteoporosis goes way up. That's when women really start to age quickly. Now, men have a different thing. We go through what we now call andropause, which is generally a very slow decline over time. And there are a lot of hormones involved, but the key one in men is testosterone. And as a man's testosterone starts to decline, all kinds of things start to happen. And, things like loss of energy and sleep and inability to gain muscle and, worsening body composition and mood instability and inability to concentrate and focus and decreased libido and all kinds of things that never are things you want to have happen. But the challenge in men is they happen so slowly over time, sort of starting in our 40s and, continuing for the rest of your life, that we're just told by our doctors, hey, you're just getting older, just live with it. That's what happens when you get older. Turns out that we can very safely replace hormones in both men and women in a medical monitored fashion and restore a lot of that vitality. And by extension, most of the studies show, and what seems to be happening is we can put off some of those chronic diseases, the things like osteoporosis and things like that.
I'm curious. So one thing I want to just kind of drill down on a little bit is this idea of hormone replacement therapy in women. Yep. Again, this was something I remember in high school and maybe it was at college or something. It was college. And I hear about people trying to decide whether or not, like parents, whether or not they were going to have that kind of treatment or not. It was really not clear. Like a lot of doctors were telling women not to do this. And it seems to me like this is probably one of the biggest mistakes we've made in the last, 20, 30 years.
I think that's very true. So the backstory that I can give you pretty quickly is that there was a big study back in the early 2000s called the Women's Health Initiative. And they looked at hormone replacement in women. And essentially the hormones that they used were drugs, not what we call bioidentical hormones. So not to sound, again, too conspiratorial, but there's not any money in marketing testosterone, estradiol, and progesterone. Those are biologically available compounds and there's no patents. You can't patent them. But what you can do is you can take, for example, estradiol and tweak it chemically, and now it's a drug and you can patent it. And instead of being 10 cents a dose, it's $2 or $10 or $100 a dose, and then you can market it. And so this Women's Health Initiative study used these synthetic hormones to investigate whether or not the symptoms of menopause could be improved in women. And they found, in fact, that they decreased their risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke and some other things, and they got better. Some of those perimenopausal symptoms like night sweats and hot flashes got better. Unfortunately, they also found that a lot of those women got breast cancer. And so what happened is the newspapers published big headlines, hormones cause cancer in women. And so a whole generation of doctors and women said, whoa, I'm not prescribing those things.
Yeah.
But, if you drill down and look at the bioidentical hormones, in other words, the same compound that the body makes and expects to see, and the ones that we give, and most of the people that are doing hormone replacement now give, there's no data showing increased risk of cancer. And there's a ton of data showing good things happen. And more important to me than the data is the experience. I mean, I have patients coming in literally every week or two saying, you've totally changed my life. Thank you. And I'm telling my sister and my friend and my daughter and my coworkers about it.
On the men's side of that, is there, obviously this is well studied, but is there any evidence that testosterone replacement actually helps with some of the chronic disease issues like, cardiovascular disease?
Oh yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of, there are lots and lots of studies on this. And, of course, like any study, you can find a counter study, right, that says the opposite. But men with low testosterone are much more likely to die sooner of cardiovascular disease. They're much more likely to get osteoporosis, much more likely to suffer from mood disorders and depression and things like that. Obviously, libido and sexual function are issues. The diabetes is way more likely in men with low testosterone. And in fact, almost every diabetic you'll ever meet has low testosterone, and maybe as a corollary to the disease, not as the cause. Wow. Dyslipidemia or the type of cholesterol findings we don't want on our blood panel is way more common with testosterone. And in fact, testosterone helps treat all of those things. The big thing that men worry about with testosterone is prostate cancer. And that's based on some very sketchy anecdotal stuff from 100 years ago, where we discovered that men with really bad prostate cancer, we could put it into remission by castrating them, which doesn't sound like much fun.
Yeah.
But, since then that's been looked at extensively, and it's actually been discovered that, first of all, testosterone doesn't cause prostate cancer. Men who have very low testosterone have a higher likelihood of high-grade prostate cancer when they have prostate cancer. And the current consensus that most urologists agree with is if you have low testosterone, get it treated. If you have prostate cancer, get it treated. But, testosterone doesn't cause it or make it worse. There are some very advanced cases where we will, essentially destroy a man's testosterone production with drugs like Lupron. Those men are miserable. Most of them, if they don't die within a couple of years from their cancer, would like to die anyway because they're so miserable because their testosterone is so low. So I think it's very safe. And Buck, the thing that's surprising, and we're seeing this every day in my practice, is young men. It used to be testosterone replacement. When I started doing this, I mean, I haven't been doing this for that long, but 10, 15 years, 12 years, 10 years, I guess now, it was 45, 50-year-old guys. Now we're seeing 30, 35-year-old guys coming in.
Now, is that because do you think that that's a change in demographics of who's got this, or do you think this is just about self-reporting?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, I think demographic, and I think it's awareness, right? But I do think there are more. I mean, gosh, there was just something published not long ago about sperm counts going down in men, and all the multifactorial stuff that's leading to that. Plastics in the environment and BPA in your water bottle, So I think we're seeing more and more men who are probably having lower testosterone at a younger age, And also they're more aware because there's more information out there on the internet. I mean, I just had my assistant call me yesterday and say, hey, I got a 27-year-old here who has low testosterone. Can we treat him? And I'm like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
It used to be that was a rare thing. And that was something you'd send to an endocrinologist. And we probably will still send him to an endocrinologist because there are other things that need to be worked up in someone that age. But I'm not surprised anymore to see a 35-year-old come in with testosterone of a total testosterone of 300, whereas it should be 800 or 900.
What do you treat at? I'm curious. There's probably a lot of guys who are aware of what their testosterone levels are. Generally, I think that the medical establishment still has a pretty high threshold for actually doing hormone replacement.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's below 300 or something like that, right? Isn't what they typically have been taught.
Yep.
But what's your threshold and why?
Well, so we don't look at the range itself. So the range, for example, at the lab we use is 250 to 1100. And I think it's nanograms per deciliter. And so most doctors will look at that and say, well, yours is 261. It's higher than 250. Don't worry about it. Because like you say, the medical establishment has long said, hey, as long as you're in the normal range, you're in the normal range. Well, those of us in the anti-aging medicine field believe there's an optimal range. And it's not just a belief. There's a lot of, studies showing that men do best in what we would call the top quartile of that range. So most men feel best. Their risk of disease, those both immediate and chronic diseases is lower when their testosterone's in the top quartile. So that's somewhere between, say, 900 and 1100.
No kidding. That high, 900 plus. Huh?
Oh, yeah. And then the other thing that we do, which is different than a lot of practices, is we measure actually the free or the bioavailable testosterone, because total testosterone can be, say, 800, but if most of a man's testosterone is bound to something called sex hormone binding globulin, which is a common protein found in everybody's blood and goes up as we age and goes up with exposure to various toxins and estrogenic substances and this, that, and the other, your total testosterone might look fine. It might look like it's 800 and your doctor might say, hey, that's great. But if your bioavailable or your free testosterone is in the bottom part of that range, if I can bring you back to the top of that range, you'll feel better. And again, I have patients, men coming in very frequently saying, hey, now I finally feel like I did 5 years ago. And now I have the motivation to go to the gym and work out, or the energy, or now when I get home from work, I don't just crash on the couch and, go to bed at 8 o'clock or whatever. So yeah.
Is there
to be optimal?
With testosterone, I've heard some people worried, like younger men who have it of infertility.
Yeah.
And is that permanent infertility or just while they're on testosterone?
It is typically while they're on testosterone. So when we give a man exogenous testosterone, essentially the brain shuts down the production of testosterone, and by extension also it doesn't always decrease a man's sperm count. And so we warn, we tend not to like treating younger patients for that reason, but then there are alternatives that can help maintain their fertility. But typically when a man goes off testosterone, their body doesn't forget how to make it. It doesn't forget they need it. It just takes about 2 to 3 months to return them back to kind of close to where they were.
Got it.
So I have patients say, do I need to be on this for life? And I say, no, as long as you want, you can be on it. You can get off at any time. You'll just go back to feeling how you did.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, fertility is an issue in younger men. And there are other medications and hormones that we use to mitigate that problem when it's an issue. But I also tell men, guess what? Testosterone is not birth control. Just because I'm giving you testosterone doesn't mean you're not going to father a child.
Point.
So make sure you take adequate precautions if that's not your goal.
That's right. There's one more pillar, right?
One more pillar and this is kind of the new one. This is the drugs pillar.
Yeah.
This is where we start to get into the real potential medical interventions for so-called anti-aging. And, this is a tough one because most of these drugs are repurposed drugs for other diseases. Interestingly, if you go talk to the FDA, they don't regard aging as a disease. There's all these diseases that sort of come with aging, but nobody has sort of, or I won't say nobody, but overall, nobody's come up with a drug that treats the so-called disease of aging. But the most prominent drugs in that space that are being studied currently, and I think are really worth considering depending on where you are in your lifespan and health span, are one called metformin. Now, people who are familiar with medications may say, well, that's a drug for diabetes. But it's interesting. Diabetics have been taking metformin for many years. It's a very inexpensive drug. I mean, you can get a month's supply for $3 or $4. It's crazy cheap. And yet there is some pretty compelling data that shows that diabetics who are on metformin actually die less frequently of some of the diseases of aging than non-diabetics. And diabetes, and yet diabetes is a known risk factor. So let's just take cardiovascular disease. If you put a big group, and this has been shown, a big group of diabetics on metformin versus an age-matched population of controls, we know diabetes leads to cardiovascular disease. And if you're not treating those diabetics with metformin, they die off a lot faster from cardiovascular disease. But if they're on metformin, they live longer than the people who aren't on metformin who don't have diabetes. And so that's led to looking more carefully at what metformin does. And it turns out it has a bunch of different mechanisms. And it looks like it does have some compelling data suggesting it potentially can extend life in sort of earthworms and, rats and things like that. Yeah. Again, it's hard to get on humans, but it makes a pretty compelling case for metformin being an anti-aging drug. Now, here's the problem. It's cheap. It's off patent for the last 25 years. So very few drug companies are going to want to put, the $500 million into studying it for that new, quote, indication. But there are studies going on metformin for anti-aging.
Another one I think you're probably going to get to is rapamycin.
Yep, rapamycin's another interesting drug, and this is probably the one that is in some ways the most compelling. It's it's used currently as an immunosuppressive drug, so people who have organ transplants. The interesting thing is, if you look at rapamycin, it works directly on a really important protein in the cells called mTOR. In fact, it's pretty funny. They used rapamycin in the lab to discover how your body's cells actually, how the metabolism works. So there is a protein in every cell, in every biological being, from an earthworm to a human being now, that has a protein in it called mTOR. And that stands for mitochondrial target of rapamycin. So rapamycin works at this extremely targeted cellular level on biological cells. And what it does is it inhibits this mTOR protein. And what that does is that basically that protein controls energy balance in the body, and it controls about 50 different pathways that tell the body or the cell how to use energy and how much energy is coming in and how much should be expended. And interestingly, again, it's shown that to increase longevity in mice, rats, dogs, earthworms, a variety of primates, monkeys, right? Apes. We just don't have good longevity data in human beings. Now, again, it's used for immunosuppression in organ transplant patients. It's off patent, so it's relatively inexpensive. You can get off patent versions. And there's some pretty compelling data on human beings, or at least anecdotal data. There's not any good long-term studies, but I think rapamycin, and the other thing is it's very well tolerated, doesn't have a lot of side effects. People say, well, what about immunosuppression? I mean, that's what it's used for. Well, we can prescribe it in different dosage protocols for anti-aging than we do for immunosuppression for, say, kidney transplants. And it's not sort of widely accepted yet as an anti-aging drug, but there are some doctors that think it is the anti-aging drug of the future.
I mean, that is the one potentially that may have the most actual research behind it, at least in, maybe not human, but other mammalian or, lesser animal models. But
pretty well studied.
Yeah. And
more to study.
Yeah. To your point though, about, rapamycin, again, this is a cheap drug, and it's remarkable how little you hear about it from, in the longevity ecosystem compared to something like NMN or, NMR.
Right.
Do you want to talk a little bit about those, and if you think that there's real validity to, or reason to consider taking those things?
Sure. So the things you mentioned, NMN and NMR, is nicotinamide mononuclear riboside, or so.
Yeah, you're bigger man than me trying to remember what that stands for.
These are variants of niacin, basically, which is a B vitamin. And so the reason we think those drugs have some value is there was a paper by a longevity scientist at, I believe, Harvard, named David Sinclair, who realized that as organisms age, the intracellular component of something called NAD decreases. NAD is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, is one of the components that is used in the Krebs cycle, which is the energy production part of a cell. Anyway, so the theory is if we know aging is related to decreasing NAD, if we can get extra NAD into the cell, it will hopefully reverse aging. And so again, there's studies in earthworms, and they use earthworms a lot because they have a quick life cycle and you can, control all the variables, but in mice and things showing using these NMN and NMR products when they can get into the cells, they might raise the NAD levels enough to potentially prevent aging. The reason you hear more about those, I think, in the anti-aging space is because they're supplements right now, and so most of the time when you go online and you look around for supplements, there's a lot of people out there that'll make money selling those supplements to you. And so you can buy these supplements. There's a number of companies that make them, and some of them have some pretty compelling data. One of them is, founded by Dr. Sinclair. And, I think if I were inclined, I'd be going that direction, for example. And I do take one of those supplements because they're safe, they're relatively cheap, they're non-toxic, but we don't have as good a data on them yet. I think we will eventually have more data. You hear more about those, I think, than you hear about things like metformin and rapamycin, because those are drugs that have to be prescribed by a physician in the U.S. anyway. And a lot of doctors don't kind of look at this space because it's not their thing, right? I mean, they're too busy doing surgery or prescribing blood pressure medications. But I think we're going to see more and more on this as time goes on, as people are more interested in a longer health span.
I don't know if you have any other major medications, but one thing I do want to touch on, because I think this is, just way underutilized, is the thing that is known as a PCSK9 inhibitor. Do you want to explain what that is?
Sure. You're going to make me remember what PCSK9 is. So
PCSK9, but PCSK9 inhibitor, basically, you don't have to use the long word.
I can explain the drug. I'm just trying to think of the name of the enzyme.
It's a monoclonal antibody.
One of the drugs, the prototype drug is called Repatha. And this is in some ways also a miraculous drug. This is a genetically engineered product. So it's one of those drugs that came about with the advent of genetic engineering. And it's an antibody to this protein in the liver that processes cholesterol. And it lowers people's LDL cholesterol by a huge amount with almost no side effects. And they've been around for about 7 or 8 years, so we've got pretty good data on safety. But the theory here is that it is almost possible at this point to certainly prevent and maybe to an extent reverse atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease using these PCSK9 inhibitor drugs. And, up till now, the best way to do this has been the statins. And statin drugs, although I'm sure, there's good data for various things on them and they've saved a lot of lives, come with a lot of, they're dirty drugs. They come with a lot of downsides. There's a lot of people who have side effects from statins. There are, a lot of issues with statins, whereas PCSK9 inhibitors are extremely clean. They target this one protein in the liver. They can drop someone's LDL from, say, 130 to 30 in a couple months. And, there's actually some studies showing reversal of coronary plaques, which is pretty amazing. I mean, if you
and there's a number, there's a threshold typically. What is that? Is that below 50 or below 40? What is that number where? I'm trying to remember. Do you remember what the number LDL number is that if you get below that, there seems to be some reversal?
I'm not sure. I don't do primarily cardiovascular stuff.
No, that's fine. Of course. And I didn't expect you to know it, but the concept though, and the reason, one of the reasons I ask about this, because I am on a PCSK9 inhibitor, and she might ask, well, gosh, why are you on a PCSK9 inhibitor? Do you have hypercholesterolemia? The answer is no. I never really did have high cholesterol. I was, I have a history of heart disease on my mom's side, and I got paranoid in my 40s, and somebody put me on a statin. And the statin, I didn't feel great with the statin, and so I just kind of got off of it over time. Then I did a
very common story.
Yeah, cardiac study. I did a great big, thing just again, because I'm, getting older, and just the same reason you went into longevity medicine, and just and the cardiologist introduced me this whole PCSK9 inhibitor, and the idea again being, okay, you don't have disease, but we can artificially, in your case, suppress your LDL to such a degree that presumably you may never have to worry about dying of cardiovascular disease. And that to me is astounding, given the fact that cardiovascular disease is the number one cause of death in the United States. But I am absolutely floored by the number of people that I know who have high cholesterol. Not even like mine was pretty normal. High cholesterol, and their primaries are like, it's fine. It's not that bad. Diet, exercise. And
right.
And completely ignore this. Peter Attia, actually, who I think is brilliant. He's a podcaster. He's a physician on The Drive, I think his podcast is called. He estimated, and I don't know how he got this, but that cardiovascular disease would go from, the first leading cause of death to probably under 10 if people routinely began using PCSK9 inhibitors, which is just, again, crazy to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've heard it theorized that we could essentially eliminate cardiovascular disease. I think they're great drugs. I mean, they seem to have very few side effects. Most of the people that take them do really well. The big problem right now, to the extent there is they're very expensive. Mm-hmm. You're looking at $500 to $600 a month, and most of the insurance companies will not even allow you to get them unless you've proven that you failed a statin and you've got documented coronary disease or this, that, or the other. And so I think part of the issue is just going to be awareness. And I think as we see more evidence that perhaps we turn around some disease, that maybe the indications will widen.
Well, you would think the insurance companies at some point might feel like it's more cost effective to prevent the disease.
Then pay for a bypass surgery.
Yeah, pay for bypass surgery, right?
Or a stent or whatever. Right. I know. I mean, Buck, another potential anti-aging drug, I just heard it proposed the other day on another podcast by another physician I know, is the GLP-1 agonist drugs, the semaglutide and things like that, as a potential anti-aging drug. And it's the same deal,
is that another diabetes drug?
Yeah, they're diabetes drugs, and they're all the rage right now for weight loss in Hollywood and places like this, because, there was a study showing you could lose 20% of your body weight. I think it was over 72 weeks using semaglutide. And it alters appetite and glucose metabolism. And again, it's this question, if you look at obesity as a potential cause of heart disease and all these other things, you'd think the insurance companies would be wanting you to get on this stuff so they could prevent further disease. And I'm sure at some level the actuaries will figure that out, that, right, if we pay for this $500 or $800 or $1,000 drug now, we can save ourselves $100,000 in hospital costs down the line.
This one has some bad side effects too, though, doesn't it?
They do. They're not super clean. I mean, people oftentimes get, nausea and vomiting and reflux and such. It
basically slows down your,
slows down your gut.
Slows your gut down.
Makes you so you feel full all the time. You don't want to eat. You feel a little, but again, for people that have been struggling for weeks, months, and years and have no other way to lose weight, it helps. It seems to help. And they start, you start at a low dose and you titrate people up. They seem to be working. I don't know that I'd want to be on that forever. And there was also a black box warning on those for thyroid cancer. So that's sort of,
nice.
They've only been around for few years. So we don't know. There's no reported cases in people yet, but we're waiting to see.
Right.
But they work. On the other hand, you have people that say it's changed their lives. So
yeah,
there's some really neat stuff in this field, in this place. And again, what we're doing now for this longevity, we're taking drugs used for a specific purpose, like these PCSK9 inhibitors, and we're saying, wow, maybe that's going to help extend lifespan if we can prevent some of the diseases of aging.
Right. Rob,
treat them.
I want to, if people want to come out and see you, tell us about where your office is and stuff.
Oh, wow. We're in far northern California, a place called Redding, a little town up near Lake Shasta. The practice is called Prestige Regenerative Medicine. Because of the type of economy in the area, we mostly focus on hormone replacement and some sexual wellness services, and also some regenerative orthopedics. So things like PRP injections into joints and things like that. But, we do some of the, when we get somebody who really wants to dive into the anti-aging type stuff, we certainly can support that. I've got a couple owner's practitioner PA working with me, and we try our best to help people live the best life they can now, and hopefully the longest, best health span they can have.
Fantastic. Rob, it's always a pleasure. I'm always texting you or emailing you my own questions, so I appreciate your time today. And people just love what you have to say. So thanks for that.
My pleasure, Buck. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's talk again soon. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed that conversation. This stuff is super exciting for me. And I've even contemplated doing maybe another podcast, or maybe changing the format of this one a little bit or something like that, so that I could do more things that are going to be of general interest to, people like you and me, but don't necessarily always have to be talking about money. This particular field, I think, is incredibly important for people to sort of start paying attention to, because I think there are things that you can do today if you're in your, 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, that can seriously, potentially alter, the way 70s and 80s and 90s, et cetera, can look for you in the future. And so hopefully we can continue giving you more of this kind of stuff. I think I certainly am going to be following closely myself, and even at our last meeting gave you a pretty good idea of what I've actually done myself and what I do myself. So that's it for me this week on Wealth Formula Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and shoot me an email and let me know what your thoughts are at buck@wealthformula.com. With that, this is Buck Joffrey signing out.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast. Visit us on the web at wealthformula.com. The information contained in this podcast are opinions, not fact. As always, consult your own financial team before making any investment. See you next time.